Bill Taylor. I'm the chief meteorologist for KENS 5 Television. I'm so glad. Thank you. And I am so privileged and honored to serve as your master of ceremonies today and welcome you to the second annual Edwards Aquifer Authority Summit Luncheon. It's a great way to learn more about, yes, right? To go to the summit on the aquifer, learn more as we move forward with all new challenges, as you know, in an ever-growing city and area. And so whether you're here in person or you're joining us live via Facebook Live, so thrilled that you're here to address this year's theme, Shaping the Future of Aquifer Management and Water Conservation, Fostering Inclusion, Imagination, and Innovation. It is so important that we adjust and adapt. Nature is nature, and nature is going to be bigger than all of us forever. The thing that we've got to do a great job in is adapting to what's happening. And it's not just nature, of course, but the population expansion and growth in this area has been second to none. I mean, for the last 10 years, this has been one of the fastest growing areas in the United States. We know that the I-35 corridor has 3 of the top 5 fastest growing communities in the United States. 3 of the top 5 are between pretty much San Marcos and Georgetown. I mean, they're expecting at least 5 to 8 million more people on that I-35 corridor. So we've got a plan. You know, we've got to make sure that we're ready and we're willing to adapt. We're also heading into a La Nina. For those of you who don't speak Spanish, that is Spanish for the Nina. Thank you. And that's just not a good thing when it comes to much needed rainfall. We're expecting a drier, milder winter because of the Nina. So we have to adapt. I should also mention that since we're going to be talking about water a lot, the restrooms are in the back left corner. Just make sure you know. Here's what's going to happen in our session that we've got with you today. First up is going to be our general manager of the Edwards Aquifer Authority, Roland Ruiz. He's going to introduce the theme, set the stage for today's discussions. We're then going to hear from Paul Bertetti, Senior Director of Aquifer Science Research and Modeling. He will follow and update us on the current state of the aquifer in order to help us learn where we stand and how we can all be a part of a thriving future and move forward. And then we're going to move into a panel discussion moderated by Sarah Schlessinger, CEO of the Texas Water Foundation. And that's going to be your opportunity, and yours too, on Facebook Live, to ask questions. You want to know more about our primary source of water in this area and how we're going to manage it. Don't you even want to know who this Edward guy is anyway? Is he here, by the way? Is Edward here? But all your questions will be answered, and we're going to have that panel discussion in just a moment. But first, without any further delay, we want to introduce you to Mr. Roland Ruiz. He serves as general manager of the Edwards Aquifer Authority, overseeing the management of one of the world's most prolific artesian aquifers. In fact, since taking this role in 2012, Roland has prioritized creating shared value in aquifer management amidst challenges such as the drought, such as population growth. He's also focused on transforming the EAA into a dynamic, service-oriented agency, emphasizing on collaboration, transparency, stakeholder engagement. Roland has a rich background in public affairs in this community, in this city, in this state. And having also served for 21 years as an elected official on the Board of Trustees for a local school district, please welcome the GM of the Edwards Aquifer Authority, Mr. Roland Ruiz.
Whenever Bill introduced you, you sound a lot better than you really are. That's how I feel today. But as I look out amongst you, I see a lot of familiar faces, a lot of friends, neighbors, and it's good to see you all here today. I wanted to also acknowledge, before we get too far into the program, we have some members of our board of directors that I wanted to acknowledge. Seated over here, we have Ben Youngblood from Bexar County. We have Ms. Rachel Sanborn from Hayes Caldwell County. Over to the back, we have Russell Persine from Medina County. We have Mr. Bruce Alexander from Medina County. We have a member of our Conservancy Board as well, and that's Mr. Don LaFear. I also wanted to acknowledge a former director going way back in the early 2000s, Mr. Johnny Rodriguez from here in Bexar County. Thank you all very much. And Bill mentioned the theme of today, shaping the future of aquifer management and conservation. And I want to hone in, though, on those three I words. I call them the three I words of inclusion, imagination, and innovation. Those three I words kind of fuel the mission. Our mission has not changed from the beginning: manage, enhance, and protect. What has changed has been the vigor and the way that we are pursuing that mission. And we're doing that through those three I words. We're trying to be more inclusive. And in being inclusive, we're opening ourselves up to more engagement with all of you, with those that are regulated by us as an agency, but even those that aren't regulated by our programs, but that somehow get touched by what we do. We want to partner, we want to be part of solutions. So that's the inclusion, and then comes the imagination. With the challenges we have in front of us, as some of them that were mentioned, population growth, the drought, recurring drought, which is created in part by this climate that is changing and is more unpredictable than it has been before. And I look to Bill to validate that. But and by the way, I wonder what Bill does when it doesn't rain, because I don't know what he has to report every night. So we have to be more creative. How can we work together? How can we break down silos that once divided us across this vast region? That's what we're focusing on. And once we think about that, we need to be innovative. You know, what are some of the solutions that we can participate in, not only to manage the aquifer, but what can we do to help each other identify solutions to better manage all of our water resources, even though we don't regulate any other resource except the Edwards. How we manage those other resources that interconnect with the Edwards matter. And so that's what today is about. We want to posture this way in front of you today. On the screen you see a logo. It's a brand new Edwards Aquifer Authority logo. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on the panel discussion. But we've made this transition because the world is changing around us and we're adapting to it. And we want to be ready for the changes that are already in front of us, to be a different kind of agency, the kind of agency that you might not expect to see in a political subdivision of the state of Texas. We are breaking the mold, if you will, of what you might expect from a regulatory agency. So I won't belabor the fact. I will ask Mr. Paul Bertetti, our Senior Director of Research and Modeling, to come up here. And I'm going to ask Paul to share with you what those aquifer conditions are today and where we are in this drought. So Paul, if you would.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm glad that we had such a great turnout here today. I'm going to talk for a few minutes. I'm going to have to step down a little bit because I have some graphs, and I'd like to be able to explain a little bit more about what's on them and use the pointer to do so. There we go. So this is essentially a shorter version to what I give to the board every month. If you tune in to the board meetings, spend a few minutes explaining what the current conditions of the aquifer are, kind of provide some information to the board members about what's happening, why we think it's happening, what the future might hold, at least in the next few weeks. And this is just a shorter version of that. Today I'm going to talk about our index wells, some of the springs, and then show you a little bit about why we're in the condition that we're in, talk a little bit about the drought. Next slide, please. So this table is current levels of the aquifer system, both for the index wells, J17 and J27. J27 is in Uvalde. It's the Uvalde County index well and what we use for the Uvalde pool. San Marcos and Comal Springs are also on there. And these are all components of the system that provide information for critical period management triggers. So each one of these has particular levels that helps us guide us with information about when we might enter in critical period management or come out of critical period management, depending on water levels. So the 27 and 17 are about 831 feet, 626 feet. Those are above sea level. So what we do is measure from the ground surface down to the water table, use the elevation at that ground surface to convert that value into an elevation for the water. And that allows us to compare water levels all across the region, kind of for the same reference. Canal Springs is down at 56 cubic feet per second. That's the amount of coming out of the springs. And those are measured every day by the U.S. Geological Survey staff. And they're measured in the morning, and they always lag about a day behind. So tomorrow morning they'll go out, take another measurement, and then they'll calculate the mean flow for the previous day. And so 56 cubic feet per second and 83 cubic feet per second in San Marcos were the values that were read this morning, and so then they were calculated for the day's average flow on the 22nd. I can just say next slide, it'd be great. Okay. That's not where we want to be, but that's okay. So the trend over the last 10 days is water levels have declined both at J27 and at J17. Canal Springs has also declined. So Canal Springs is very tied in very much with what J17 does in Bexar County. So the pressure in Bexar County changes, water flow at Canal Springs changes directly with that. San Marcos Springs also changes based on that, but not as much. So it doesn't have as much connection to the changes at J17 as some of the other components in the system. I put an extra table here, the departure from average, so that lets you know, well, what would we normally be out in Uvalde and in Bexar County on October the 23rd. So if I take all the values from history and look at the value for October 23rd, well, that value is usually about 35 feet higher than it is today. Similarly, in Canal Springs, the flow at Canal Springs is about 230 cubic feet per second less than it normally is at this time of year. So that's an indication of, the magnitude and the situation of the current drought, and that's why we're in stage 4 of critical period management. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is a graphical representation of that table that I just showed. And so it may be hard to see, but over here we have the water levels in feet versus the time, and this is time over the last year. So these are water levels from last October to date. Stage listed in colors here for critical period management, for in this case for Uvalde Pool. And the blue line is the actual measured water level. And that little light gray line that's hard to see, that's the 10-day average. So we actually manage the system based on 10-day average, so we don't have a lot of up and downs and changes. And this dashed line up here is the mean value historically for that period of time. And so, as you know, around 866, whereas today, the current value in Uvalde is 831, and the 10-day average is about the same. So if you notice, we've had some rain this year in Uvalde, but not a whole lot. The last couple lines substantially over the year, and they're kind of stabilized but still low. But one of the things to remember is we manage the Uvalde pool differently from the San Antonio pool. So Uvalde pool has been in stage 5 this year. So they're already in stage 5, or the most restrictive critical period management, and that's a 44% reduction in permitted volumes for those permit holders in the Uvalde pool. Next slide, please. So this is the same plot for J17 that represents the San Antonio pool. Again, you have water levels. You kind of have this trend of increase and decrease in water levels over the year. And the water levels this year kind of followed that same trend. Significant rainfall events that lets us fill up the tank. But the aquifer is performing kind of like we would expect for the rainfall that we've gotten in the region this year. The problem is we've lowered those water levels because have significantly lower rainfall over the last 2 or 3 years, and that's really caused a reduction. So we need one of these big rain events or a series of big rain events to refill the tank. You need a really big rain event to get back to normal levels. So let's look at what's happening around the region in terms of the drought. This next slide, please. This is drought in our region. Again, this is our region. Here's Bexar County, and this outline is the recharge zone. So this is kind of the National Weather Service region for our area. In October of 2021, there's really no drought. And this is put together by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, their drought monitor. It really looks at soil dryness, and it's kind of oriented to agricultural practices, but it's updated, and they do include a little bit of groundwater information when they produce these maps. Look at what's happened since February of 2022 to October of 24. During that whole period, over about 33 months, some or all of the recharge zone area and the contributing zone, which supplies a lot of the rain and then runoff that crosses the recharge zone, had been at least in severe to significant drought. Right? So this area in particular, focused along the contributing zone in our region, has been in drought for a very long time. Has it diminished in 2024 with kind of normal rainfall? It did, but it's not enough to actually get more water into the system. So this is a great indication of kind of the intensity of what's been happening over the last 3 years almost. Next slide, please. So if we look at how much rainfall we should have gotten over the whole region over the last 2 years, right, from January of 2022 to October of 2024, we get a map that has a distribution a little more in the east and a little less in the west. And then we take what we've actually gotten and subtract that from that. This is our depth departure from average rainfall over those 2.5 years. So we should have gotten rainfall, the areas in the light white color have gotten about average rainfall over the last 2.5 years. Areas in the blue have gotten a little bit more than average, about 10 inches more over the last 2.5 years. Areas in red and pink have gotten significantly less than average over the last 2.5 years. So if you notice, spatially it's a little bit different than we might expect. Kind of in the central part in the west, it's kind of been a little bit normal in terms of rainfall and precipitation. In the east, it's been significantly lower than we might expect, especially over this part of the contributing zone. And this map can really highlight why those folks that have Trinity Aquifer wells and those folks in the hill country are really hurting for water as well, right? Their water levels are very low, and that's also impactful for them. And this is a really good indication of why that's the case. So what about this drought is different from others? Why are we close to stage 5? Go to the next slide, please. So this is just a plot of all the droughts we've had in the region since the 1930s. Okay? And what we did is we kind of calculated, well, how low have water levels been during the periods of those droughts? And so that's the average depth below stage 1. We use stage 1 or 660 feet at the Bexar County well as kind of our target. For below than that, then we should be in drought. We have to be below that stage for 3 months before we count it as a drought. And then the drought duration is listed here on the bottom. So some of these are, 1 year is about right here. So a lot of these droughts were less than 1 year. So I did not label them. But then we have a handful of droughts that certainly lasted longer than 1 year. You can see the drought of record in the 1950s is not only very intense, has significant depth below stage, right? We've been in low water levels for a very long time, for more than 2,700 days. Now that's the difference between that drought of record and droughts that we've had lately, right? Significant. But all of y'all remember kind of 2011, 2014, that drought most recently. Well, that fits here. The current drought is up here. So what's different? Almost all these droughts kind of follow along this trend, and this just kind of helps guide your eye to see how these are all related. The current drought has significantly lower water levels than we've experienced for droughts of these magnitudes over the history of the aquifer system. Why is that? Well, we've had significantly less rainfall. That 2022 rainfall, when we had some 11 inches, I think, at San Antonio Airport, was very significant. So we're really in deficit. So as this drought continues, I would expect it to kind of go along this line and probably will trend eventually back down to that line. That depends if we actually get some rainfall. September and October are one of the most substantial months in terms of rainfall in this region. We've had nearly zero rainfall since the beginning of September. So unfortunately, January and February, December, January, February are typically, on average, lower rainfall months. I think the projection coming up, we might not have another chance of rain until maybe closer to the first week in November. So we're looking forward to changes in the system, but for right now, we have to expect we're going to have these drought conditions. They're likely to continue along maybe through the beginning of the year. And unless we get a significant storm event, right, tropical system, rainfall, kind of those things that we call, major floods, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to refill the tank maybe until next spring or thereafter. Next slide, please. So system, I think we have a series of Q&A and other discussions, and I'll be here afterward, so I'll be happy to answer any questions that y'all might have about any of the stuff that I showed today. And I'll give it back over to Bill. And
Right. Thank you, Paul.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Paul. Let's hear for Paul Bertetti, walking us through this. Thank you so much. A very special guest with us here as well. I want to recognize Bexar County Judge Peter Sakai is with us. Great to see you, Judge. So again, big thanks to Paul and Roland as well for just kind of laying the landscape of what I hope got you interested in this. Because again, we're going to have this panel discussion that is open to everyone in this room and on Facebook, because we don't want anyone leaving with a question unanswered. This is a great moment and opportunity for us to all kind of learn and move into this. So I'll be roaming the room with the microphone as we get things started and this panel underway. Joining us on this panel will be Roland Ruiz, our General Manager of the EAA, Marc Friberg, EAA's Deputy General Manager, Mark Hamilton, Executive Director of Aquifer Management Services, and Scott Storman, Executive Director of Threatened and Endangered Species. Now, moderating the conversation will be Sarah Schlessinger, CEO of the Texas Water Foundation. Sarah is a leader in water conservation and policy, with more than 20 years' experience in water resource management. In fact, under her direction, the Texas Water Foundation has launched innovative programs educating the community and advocating for sustainable water use. She offers a wealth of knowledge and a strong commitment to engaging communities in water issues. Sarah has previously worked in groundwater policy and regulation, has experience with international nonprofits as well as disaster response. Currently, Sarah is serving as an appointed member of the Water Conservation Advisory Council and as a board member for Texas Water Trade and Open ET. So please welcome Sarah and our panel for today's discussion.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for that introduction. 20 years, that was alarming. As a means of introducing this panel, I like to zoom out, start with the big picture, and that is that Texas has always been and will always be a high water risk state. Our history is one of perpetual drought, as indicated by that graph, punctuated by disastrous flood. That is Texas. That has not changed, but the droughts are getting worse, the floods are getting worse, and there are several things that have changed about Texas as well, and it was alluded in the introduction that some of that has to do with the 70% population growth that we're projected to see over the next 50 years. It also has to do with the aging and deteriorating infrastructure that we experience across the state. It also is our natural infrastructure, like our rivers and our aquifers, are under increasing risk and pressure. That population growth is happening, yes, in our urban growth corridors, which is placing more pressure on groundwater in particular. And our human infrastructure, our workforce, additionally, is under increasing stress. So while Texas has always been high water risk, the conditions are changing, right? And now, not everybody is fortunate to have a prolific aquifer like the Edwards or a regulatory entity like the EAA as well. And so we want to talk a little bit today about a state of the union, right? The conditions that we've just heard about, the impacts of drought, the tools that have been developed over time to prepare for this, and also reasons for hope and stories moving forward. And as was indicated, I really invite you to ask questions throughout. I will pause and make sure and check in with you. There will certainly be time at the end if you want to wait until the end of the conversation, but if you have a burning question along the way, raise your hand. The microphone will find you. So let's start off with you, Roland. Texas as a whole is at an inflection point in terms of water security. If you look at national trends and global trends, water security is going to be a primary concern. But the EAA, of course, covers a pretty significant stretch of central Texas where a lot of that population growth is happening. You've talked a little bit about some of those conditions already, but if you can, could you just tell us a little bit about what you're up against as an entity in those changing conditions and challenges and, you know, our prolific but fragile aquifer, what are the challenges?
Well, is this on? Can y'all hear me? Okay. I think the challenges have been outlined already, but I think in practical terms what that means is we're seeing across our region a lot of our water purveyors, our water utilities, our cities struggling with what they're going to do to meet demands in the future, knowing that we're dealing with a finite resource in the Edwards. It has, historically, the Edwards will replenish itself when it does have rain, as Paul alluded to. But absent that, the capacity is a known quantity. You know, we have a regulatory program that has helped us manage through droughts in recent history. But the allocation of water rights to this aquifer is not going to change. It's not going to be increased. We know that. So we're managing within that limitation. And so I mentioned earlier about having those 3 I words, about having to be inclusive and imaginative and innovative. That's why. It's because we're facing conditions that we haven't faced before. We, as an agency, of course, as an entity, were created out of similar challenges back 30 years ago. I like to say that we were born out of chaos, and we've worked tirelessly over the past 3 decades to move us towards greater certainty. And I think we've made a lot of progress. But now the conditions are changing around us, and we're having to pivot and go back to revisiting, is what we're doing, how are we doing? And so the droughts that were mapped out on that map that Paul Bertetti showed you, for example, the one of 2012 to 2015, was one of our early tests of the conservation measures we now have in place through our habitat conservation plan, which gets to the crux of why we were created, and that was to ensure continuous minimum spring flows emanating from this aquifer in Comal and San Marcos. And so we withstood that test. The programs proved themselves, but now we find ourselves in the midst of another test. And so far, everything is working the way it should. The challenge for us is we don't know how long a drought will ever last. And so we're just managing through droughts, and to your point, we're managing through drought to get to the next rain event. And we'll do it on a recyclable way, probably forever. Our new logo kind of has that infinity feel towards. Our work is kind of like that. It's kind of on an infinity loop. Our work is never done. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but I'm kind of wandering off here.
And now I see that infinity loop. That really makes sense to me. So, okay, you alluded to the birth of EAA. Marc, I want to transition over to you and ask you to, groundwater is managed in the state of Texas primarily through political subdivisions called groundwater conservation districts. The EAA was created for a very specific reason and has its own part of the Texas Water Code. And it was created with very specific management objectives, right? And it was created through these tools as an adaptive management plan, right? So that you're responding to those conditions, which is really progressive. I mean, really on the cutting edge in the world. Tell us about the critical period management. It was alluded to earlier. What is that? Why is that important? And what are we experiencing now?
Sure. It's critical period management, or CPM, as we commonly refer to it, is a response to drought conditions that we implement whereby we curtail authorized amounts on a permit holder's overall permit. So as conditions get worse, a permit holder is allowed to pump less water. And it's a harsh regulation. And in a sense, we are essentially dropping that responsibility in the lap of the permit holder while they're dealing with everything that you just talked about, while they're dealing with population growth, while they're trying to meet demands. It's interesting in that when critical period was first considered by the EAA's predecessor agency and by the EAA in the beginning, it was really an emergency drought plan that was kind of difficult to implement. And then in 2007, with some amendments to the EAA Act, it was codified, whereby, and there's a chart up on the screen now that basically links percent reductions to aquifer or spring flow conditions. It's a little confusing in that as we go through stages in our critical period management plan, it'll say, okay, so you're now under a 40% reduction because we're in stage 4. It's not an automatic 40% reduction. It's pro rata over the year. How many days have you been in a 40%? So the maximum we've ever had is a 36% reduction. Go ahead.
So zoom out for me again. So the EAA was created in order to maintain certain conditions in the aquifer, protection of endangered species, right? Of course, there are several uses and dependencies on the aquifer. This was created as a tool. When was it created?
Well, it predated the 2007 amendments to the Act. It's been around as part of our rules since we were in existence, essentially. But it was codified in 2007, and as we got a habitat conservation plan, which Scott will talk about later, it became more important into how we manage the aquifer. And what's been interesting, and it's worked over time, it's always been referred to as emergency drought planning, and that's really not the case. It's really aquifer management now. In the last 15 years, we've only had 3 years where we didn't have a cutback. We've never reached stage 5 for the San Antonio pool, but we probably will in the next couple days or week. It will probably be there. But what's interesting is it's worked, and it's worked in a way where we really don't have any carrots. We have no incentive to help you cut back. We just have a really big stick, and that's the legislative action that was taken that directs the EA to make these curtailments. But throughout all of implementation, even in the 2011 through 2014 drought, when we got into severe restrictions, last year, it's worked. People have been able to live within their permits. People have been able to find ways to make adjustments and come through for the good of the region and for the good of their constituents, and to stay within the legal realm of the EAA's regulatory scheme. Why that's the case, as I think over time, as things have gotten more predictably worse is a bad thing to say, but when people can plan that they're going to have curtailment, and it's not just this flash out of the sky, they can make the appropriate plans. If we go to stage 5 next week, we don't have like a special lever in the back of our office where you're not capable of pumping. You're going to have to do something. You're going to have to plan. And over time, I think we've been able to fill that lack of incentive-based programs with education, with trying to provide a service. You know, we do the best we can to be matchmaker, help you find additional water. We provide calculators and forecast tools to help you understand what you're going to need in a worst-case scenario by the end of the year. And I think that's helped us make that program successful.
Mm. So I want to linger on what you just shared. Based off of the current conditions, it looks like you might enter stage 5 next week. Has that happened before?
Not for the San Antonio pool. The people that live, if there's anyone from Uvalde here, they've gone an entire year in stage 5, and they successfully met their needs. The city of Uvalde successfully met their needs through an entire year. They had a full 44% cutback, and that's because they've planned and they have additional water. I hope it's because they've taken advantage of some of the resources that we provided, but the program is successful, and it's helped sustain this aquifer through the 2011-2014 drought. And I think you can see we're in bad shape, but it's not dire at this point in time, and a lot of it has to do with these types of programs.
Tough gig being a regulatory entity. Roland, I want to come back to a conversation you and I were having earlier around this feeling like a stress test. And you were reflecting on the last time Texas really experienced significant drought in the 2011, 2013 timeframe. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're observing and the difference in the conditions having changed and how you're using this tool to manage for that?
Yeah, I think this current drought, it started out looking very much like 2011, the 2012, 2015 timeframe, but now it's feeling, as Paul alluded to on the slide, it seems to be more intense. And I think the misnomer, or the misperception is you get, for example, this July, we had good rainfall and things greened up. And mentally you think we're out of drought. But we're at such a deficit from prior year deficit that it starts to build upon each other. And so the programs that we have in place then are really put to the test. So you see that spring flow, which is the ultimate measure of how the programs are working, spring flow is low, but it has not, the springs have not gone dry. And that was what happened in the historic drought of record in the 1950s. Comal Springs went dry for 5 months. And that's what we're mitigating against. So I've said this forever, that what we do, there is no silver bullet to take care of everything. We just work, and when we're not in drought, we're planning for the drought. And when we get in drought, we're implementing to carry us through the drought. And we're, to Marc's point, what we've done, not just through the regulatory programs, we've also now incorporated incentivized programs through the HCP where we will incentivize conservation because Edwards water rights have been monetized because of the regulatory scheme. They now have a real value in an economic market, and we've incentivized conservation that way, leveraging that monetization to the benefit of the aquifer itself. Those two ideas don't always connect in one's mind because you think if you monetize something, it becomes a commodity. It's just people out for the money, but it's actually helped bolster conservation across the region during drought and even when we're not in drought.
So to Marc's earlier point about having a bundle of carrots and sticks, it's a combination of the regulatory and the non-regulatory incentives that you feel have been benefited the aquifer.
It really is, and we're trying to introduce even more carrots, if you will, in a more thoughtful way, not just by incentivizing less use of the aquifer, but how can we maximize use of the aquifer when it does have water? And when I say that, looking at creative solutions like helping to foster the development of aquifer storage and recovery. Sure. So, SAWS has been kind of a leader in that example of taking your Edwards water when there's plenty and storing it underground in another aquifer that's conducive to doing that. And I think we're seeing now a movement across the region where there's entities that are starting to think about that as a real potential solution, making their water portfolio include other ways to stretch their Edwards water beyond just the current calendar year. Sure. And that's ASR helps do that. So I know that we're also feeling pressures of growth, especially out west in the region. I know the I-35 corridor has been blowing and going for a long time, but we're starting to see now that in Medina County, where there's a spillover effect from Bexar County into Medina County with a lot of development, and it's stressing resources there as well. So we see people coming together to start to think about solutions, and we're positioning ourselves at the middle of that to try to facilitate those solutions. We don't have all the answers, but we have a lot of experience and we have a lot of lessons learned from the past almost 30 years that we're happy to share that and help facilitate some of that thoughtful consideration through those 3 I words that I mentioned.
As we zoom out and look at Texas as a whole, looking at water security, we're seeing increasing trends in people wanting to diversify their water portfolios to reduce risk. And San Antonio is certainly a leader in that advancement, that investment. We're sitting here in San Antonio. Now that we've addressed the elephant in the room, which is drought and the impacts, we want to move on a little bit to talk about the aquifer, the science, what we're learning. So Marc number 2, Marc Hamilton. We've got 2 Marcs sitting next to each other, y'all. I still don't know where Edward is in between y'all, but tell us about the science of the aquifer, how we understand it, what's contributing to managing the aquifer in times of drought. We heard, the state of the union in terms of monitoring, but tell us a little bit about the aquifer science and what you're seeing as trends.
Well, I was thinking as Marc was talking about the critical period chart, those numbers didn't just appear, nobody just guessed and said, hey, why don't we cut back 15% or 20% or 30%? If you look back at the historical record, we have almost 100 years of data for the aquifer. We have about 100 years of water level data. We have a lot of spring flow data and recharge data. That data set continues to become more and more robust over time as the ability to collect data increases, becomes more easy with some remote equipment and telemetry. But think of all that massive data being used to compile some really high level, really sophisticated and robust groundwater models that can be used to analyze different scenarios, different conservation measures. How do we effectively regulate the system, maximize the amount of available water for all the permit holders while still maintaining spring flow? So that's really, in some sense, where the science comes in, right? It's a very useful tool to help to inform policy in a way that everybody, I was going to say benefits, or maybe given the drought situation, everyone suffers equally, if that makes sense.
Well, thank you for that. And of course, we've talked a lot about permit holders so far, but the Edwards, as we know, was created to protect endangered species. And so I want to move on to you, Scott, and ask a little bit about the Habitat Conservation Plan. Can you tell us what that is?
Sure. The Edwards Aquifer Habitat Conservation Plan is a program that was set up in 2013. It's a permit that was authorized by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service called an incidental take permit. And the incidental take permit has 5 permittees that are part of this program. And those permittees are the City of San Marcos, Texas State University, the City of New Braunfels, San Antonio Water System representing the City of San Antonio, and the Edwards Aquifer Authority. The EAA serves as the managing entity to manage the program, which is the program that I oversee. And the intent is to create protections for habitat and the endangered and threatened species that are listed as part of the permit. The species, some of the more famous ones you might have heard of are the Texas blind salamander. You might have heard that species. That's probably the one that has most note. Then there's also, there's the Comal Springs riffle beetle. There's the fountain darter, Texas wild rice. If you ever float the river in San Marcos, you'll have seen stands of Texas wild rice. Some people don't like to get it because they think it's a little icky, but it's actually very pretty in our world. We appreciate the prolific nature of it. But the plan is intended to, it has spring flow protection measures involved in it, has conservation measures involved in it, and these spring flow protection measures are some of the things that Marc Friberg has mentioned as far as our VISPO and our ASR programs, which are forbearance programs that many of you possibly participate in as a part of the regulated community. And then we also have habitat restoration programs and projects that we do with the City of San Marcos and the City of New Braunfels and their 2 spring systems. And so there's a lot of work and effort that's gone into it. It started in 2013. It runs till it's a 15-year permit. It runs until the end of 2028, or the middle part of 2028, excuse me. And we're in the process of going forward with a new extended permit, which would start in 2028 and run for a 30-year run. And we're in the process of moving through that process with our stakeholder community, our permittees, and with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Thank you. Why is it important, Roland, having a habitat conservation plan?
The thing about a habitat conservation plan, protecting the species that have been listed under federal law that means that we're required to provide some level of protection for. The reason we have this plan and we have an incidental take permit is really to protect the users of the aquifer from legally, to protect us as a region from that. Now, going way back to when we were created, there was lawsuits filed around this whole issue that led to our creation, and I'm looking at Robert Puente, who was in the legislature at the time. So if you want to blame anyone, but I joke, but it
Roland, he's my boss.
It was a chaotic time for the region, and it was all having to do with spring flows or lack thereof in the event of a drought, of a historic drought. So the HCP gives us that coverage. It gives us legal coverage as a region. And back in the famous or infamous decision that Judge Bunton issued, there was the real threat, the real risk that this local state resource would have been under the hands of a federal entity to manage. That didn't happen because the legislature came up with the EAA as a solution. And for many years, we kind of grappled with what it meant to ensure continuous minimum spring flows, which is language out of our statute. And that ended up being defined for us in 2007 in that session through this Edwards Aquifer Recovery Implementation Program, which led to this HCP. And so there's a whole lot of background there. We don't have an HCP just because we want to be good stewards. We do want to be good stewards of the natural resource, but there's a very real, tangible benefit to everyone who uses the Edwards to have an HCP in place because it protects your ability to tap into the aquifer and use it.
Thank you. I want to pause and look at, are there any questions so far?
Yeah, we talked about the population growth. How much does that translate into demand? I haven't seen any demand issues other than restricted demand.
So the question, just going to repeat it, sir, for the audience, is we've talked a lot about the drought conditions and the population growth, but how does that translate over to demand? What's the data around the demand increase? Is that correct?
The best source for those demand projections, I would direct y'all to the state water plan. The Texas Water Development Board has a plan for the entire state by region, and in our region, as you look ahead, it shows a deficit because of the growing demand of water availability in our region. Historically, because of the Edwards and because of our permitting system, a lot of that shortage has been addressed through the transfer of Edwards rights amongst permit holders. If you are in a city and there's another city who has excess water, there's ability for them to lease or transfer that water to them and let them use it for that year. So that has helped take care of some of that demand in the past. But looking ahead, there's less and less latitude, there's less and less capacity because of the demand growth coupled with what we think will be more recurring drought on a recurring basis. So the data shows up in the state water plan, and right now the latest water development board plan is under development and process, and very shortly we will have the latest. We will look ahead. So,
based off of the 2022 state water plan on a statewide scale, we're seeing at least a 20% increase in demand on a statewide level and almost a 20% decline in water availability. Coupled then with aging infrastructure that is experiencing water loss, you don't have to be a water scientist to figure out that there is a serious water budget gap. So on a regional and on a local scale, you certainly need to look to your individual utilities and regional plans, but on a statewide scale, it's driving a lot of really significant statewide policy. Thank you for the good question on demand.
We've got one over here on the left.
Sure.
Sorry if I'm out of school, but I'm in Hill Country Village near Hollywood Park. And I think part of the thing is that we talk about this. We've talked about it for many years. And I think part of it is changing culture. It's not just that we're in a drought or whatever, but we imported the English lawn and the Northeast North Carolina green lawn, which is not native to San Antonio. And so you can talk to our friends at the water system, Karen Guz and others over there, that, I mean, half of our water consumption is on pissing it away on lawns versus health, safety, and welfare to wash our dishes and health, safety, sanitation kind of things. How do we change the culture is the long-term solution. I mean, we have more people here. We have more water usage. We have people that need to wash their clothes and their dishes. How do we change the culture?
That is a wonderful question, and thank you for bringing up a very salient point regarding how we prioritize water usage, which gets really complicated really quickly. What I'm going to do, sir, if you don't mind, in terms of the question is I'd like to couple it with the next question as well, just so we can hear both, if you wouldn't mind.
Coming to you, I saw that.
I think there was one right over.
Right over here? Just a minute, ma'am. I got you.
Sure.
Oh, it kind of goes along. I was just wondering, does the Edwards Aquifer keep track? Does the Edwards Aquifer keep track of how much of the usage that y'all are tracking is municipal and how much is industrial and how much is agricultural? Are the general percentages?
So I'd like to couple the two questions. The question was, how do we change the culture around water waste and water conservation? And does the EAA track how much water is being used on municipal versus ag versus other uses?
Okay. Okay, we do track it. I'm not going to be able to tell you off the top of my head, but majority of the use is municipal, followed by agricultural, followed by industrial. As far as changing the culture, I think, and not taking on lawn watering directly, I think it's incumbent upon organizations like the Edwards Aquifer Authority to provide those carrots that we spoke about earlier, provide opportunities for conservation, different programs that we've tried to put in place. I mean, the curtailment program that we have, our critical period management program, as it is implemented more often, speaks directly to that. Users are going to have to make a decision. Their authorization is going to be less, and so where is the best place for them to place it? And if they're not willing to reduce a specific use, what types of conservation measures are they willing to implement to help stretch their water rights, to help meet those extra demands, and how can we help that? And some of the programs that we've tried to implement are aimed directly at that. The hope would be, from a cultural standpoint, that as neighbors see success from neighbors, they will incorporate it into their own lives. As entities see success from other entities, they will incorporate that into their own programming. But to the initial question, what's interesting with the Edwards, and I do have some Edwards stats off the top of my mind as far as impacts of demand, and it's really a result of diversification, the work that SAWS has done, the work that other utilities have done. If you look at the way we manage Edwards pumping, so Edwards authorization, demand on the Edwards, every year there's no more than 572,000 acre feet that's permitted. There's reductions to that authorized amount by critical period, these percentages that we've been talking about, which gives you a authorization per year. In 2014, there was still water left on the table. That was the worst we had seen from a critical period standpoint until last year. There was 50,000 acre feet of water left on the table. Last year was worse. There was 60,000 acre feet of water left on the table. This year is going to be worse than last year as far as cutbacks. I don't know how much is going to be left on the table, but I know there will be some left on the table. So the demand on the Edwards has stayed fairly constant, but that's because of all the work that everyone in this room has been doing. I don't know what that's going to look like in 10, 15 years. We may not have any water left on the table. And so to your point, we will need to find ways to incentivize different actions to help meet our needs.
I've got one on this side of the room.
Can I go back to that culture question? At the San Antonio water system, we obviously have a huge vested interest in this. Because of the drought, these statistics are a little bit old, but over the last 20 years, we are using the same amount of water that we were just changed our drought watering rules to make them more susceptible, more easier for the customer to use, understanding that water is a big energy user, changing the hours. Our business model is to convince our customers to buy less of our products. Can you imagine running a business like that? And we're very good at, we actually pay customers to use less of our water. So the culture is changing, but any culture takes a long time, takes generations. And we've been doing that since the 1990s, since SAWS has been in existence, with the help of our regulator, the Edwards office.
Before we go to the, I thank Robert for that response, because that's very on the mark. I also wanted to point something else out that we have, to get to the culture question long term. Part of what we envision as the next generation of our work is to validating with science some of the issues that you're pointing out. You know, we have now a field research park here in Northeast Bexar County, 150-acre tract of land that we are testing and demonstrating practices with native vegetation, native soils, and we're trying to prove that if you stay native and let nature do its natural work, you end up with similar outcomes, and you don't have to import non-native type of plants. And I'm speaking out of school here. If Marc Hamilton needs to correct me here, but he oversees that program. And so I think over time we will have more technical data to validate improved conservation practices, not only in municipal areas, but also in more rural areas across the region.
Thank you for that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the new era of the EAA, but I'd like to turn to your question.
Thank you. It's been reported that the clay pipes that are service pipes into the streets are so leaky that we lose 40% of our water to leakage before it ever hits the meter. And I'm wondering how that affects the aquifer and specifically SAWS, and more particularly, what are we going to do about it?
Sounds like there are multiple responses. Would we like to start with the aquifer? Is there any statement around how aging infrastructure impacts the aquifer?
Well, as far as tracking use of the Edwards, those leaks would be past our required meters. So the losses are incorporated into the use that we've been talking about. And I know that every utility in here is struggling with aging infrastructure and trying to do the best they can to address that. But I can't speak to the actual fixing of the pipes. I just know it's not missed by the overall oversight of the Edwards and how much water is being originally pumped before it's put into a distribution system.
Put another way, if you have leaking infrastructure, you're paying for it as a utility because it's coming off of your permit. It's as though you used that water, even though you didn't use it, you just lost it. So there's an incentive built in to repair that and take care of it, and that's for the utilities to address.
Not to put Robert Puente back on the spot, but SAWS is not, every water utility in the nation is experiencing aging infrastructure. Can you tell us a little bit about your focus on it?
Thank you. You know, aging infrastructure, we have a system that has over 7,000 miles of water main. At any given time, what we just put in 10 years ago becomes 10 years old, then 20, then 30. So it's a constant change of our water, of replacement of our water pipelines. Jolynn Jameson, our board chair, is here. She and the rest of the board have really emphasized lost water in the last 3 months, and we have had workshops on it, on how we're going to address it. So if you look at our expenditures, they are astronomical as far as increased spending on replacement of water lines, making sure that we don't have those leaky infrastructure. The 40% is really for other smaller utilities. Our lost water is much less than that, but it's still something that we're addressing. We're paying a lot of money, our ratepayer money, to address it and make sure we lower those numbers as much as possible.
Thank you. So I think perhaps let's start looking forward, and I'll come back. Justin, go ahead.
You know, that lost water goes somewhere, right? So
Indeed. So whenever we're having a conversation about increased demand, right, drought conditions, I think it's normal to talk about, well, are we making good, efficient use of the water that we already have? That's clearly always the focus. It's worth noting that the Texas legislature, the last legislative session, passed a bill that created a new fund, the Texas Water Fund, which was approved through a constitutional amendment that has a focus on aging infrastructure as well, and statewide awareness to your question around. So know that the questions you've asked are very much not just throughout the EAA, but also on a statewide scale are being focused on by the Texas legislature as well. So I want to come back, Marc and Scott, to you and ask where we go from here. We've got good science, we know that, right? We've got a regulatory entity that's been set up. We've got critical management tools. We've got protection of endangered species. What other tools could be used, and what gives you hope?
So we can talk about good news now. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, let's talk about some good news.
Well, in my view, there are a couple of things that are really important. So the city of San Antonio, for example, has had a long-standing easement or conservation easement program, and they call it their Edwards Aquifer Protection Program. You know, the conserving properties across the contributing and recharge zone of the system is really, really important in terms of maintaining the historical functionality of that system. You know, this system recharges on average 700,000 acre feet of water per year. Maybe not this year or last year, but the reason it can do that is that there's a vast amount of land where that can happen in a unencumbered fashion. The streams, the ephemeral streams, have a lot of different types of solution features and recharge features in them, and it's possible for the system to refill itself very rapidly when we do get those really big rain events. So I think easement land, protected land is important, but I've learned in the last 4 or 5 years, there's another component to that, and we're exploring that at our field research park, and that is, how can we make that easement land even more functional in terms of its ability to maintain historical water quality and water quantity? So we've gone down this path of installing different types of nature-based solutions. We've started looking at the importance of soil health, diversity of vegetation types, increasing the number of native types of vegetation. Now we're doing the hard part. We've installed all of this nature-based solution-related infrastructure, if you will, and you'll see some pictures going through on the screens. Now we're trying to quantify that. How well does that really work? Is this something that could be part of our next generation initiative to find a way to perhaps accomplish the enhanced part of our mission, right?
Are you treating data like infrastructure too?
Well, I will say our biggest issue we have right now with this process is, like every good project or research program that you start, if it depends on rainfall, that's when you get a drought. So we've really suffered from a lack of rainfall to collect data about how functional these structures might be. But my hope would be that can we quantify this to a point such that we can say, you know what, this type of land management feature, whether it's a conservation terrace or a rock structure or whatever it might be, improves the soil by this much, we can increase water holding capacity by this much, and we can increase infiltration by this much. And then if we can go so far as to be able to decipher, well, of that increase, how much of that becomes what we would call diffuse recharge, how much might become base flow to a nearby stream, and how might that benefit the system overall? So can we be 1%, 0.1%, or 10% effective? I don't know. But I view this as a positive. This is a path forward to do something to enhance versus find a way to cut back more. Instead of revisiting the CPM, maybe we can find a way to put a little bit more water in the system. Maybe we can make the landscape just a bit less brittle, so when we have these high-intensity droughts, we don't wind up with really hydrophobic soils and lose that first flush a big rainfall that we finally do get. So we have a long way to go on this, but it perhaps is the most exciting work that I've ever had an opportunity to be a part of.
Sure, thank you. Scott, can I turn to you and say what, as you look at the critical habitat protection, what gives you hope?
I think one thing that, excuse me, the HCP, among other efforts regionally, has accomplished, and I think what gives me hope for the next 30 years as we enter a new permit phase, is that we've matured as a process and as partners in a process beyond kind of some of the distrust and acrimony that existed, say, 20 years ago. And now we're at tables talking about things from forbearance programs that help protect springs that are 40, 50 miles away, that are linked through a common aquifer system. And these discussions are now fostering positive relationships and strengthen these relationships that I think as a region we should take pride in, because I think a lot's been accomplished. And I think and the HCP is not the only forum that this has happened. This has happened through the regional water planning efforts as well. But it is a forum where something controversial has led to something positive, and I think it's going in a very helpful direction. And that's what we've tried to foster in the past 6-7 years as we've worked on this intently. And as far as where we're going, I think that the next permit will only improve that, because the issues only get more complicated as we move forward, especially as you start to factor in climate change and such.
I think that's a wonderful point, and I think that Texas actually generally should feel very proud of the fact that it is a national leader in thinking through these really hard challenges. So I want to come back to where we started, Roland, which is that you set the theme today as shaping the future of aquifer management and water conservation, and that is bold and innovative, and definitely looking towards the future and the role that EAA plays in the state of Texas and in the nation, dare I say. And you're entering a new era, not just in the pressures that you're experiencing now with increasing severity in the droughts, but also in the opportunity to help shape the future with these tools, with these different efforts. You talked a little bit about the new branding. What's the significance of it? Tell us about what comes next.
Well, in a brand is basically who you are as an entity. We all are familiar with, Michael Jordan is probably the most recognizable brand. I'm not Michael Jordan, but so who are we? What do we do? What do people think of when they think of EAA? And I know what they used to think of, 20 years ago. And I venture to say that people don't think of us in the same way as they did 20 years ago. We've looked at that with some research and some surveying and polling in the region to see what people think of us. And where we end up at is with the theme for today when we talk about shaping our future. There was a time where we couldn't even begin to contemplate shaping our own future. We were a young agency. We were just moving 1,000 miles a minute just to get this new regulatory program in place that had never been taken on before in the state of Texas. And we were trying to get it right. And it took the better part of 10 to 15 years to do that. And so we were literally drinking out of a fire hose for so long trying to get it straight. Only with the advent of the HCP back in around the 2012, 2013 area, we started to get to the point where we could catch our breath and look ahead and think, you know what? We've made so much progress now, not to mention getting past all the litigation that was on our docket. That was a big hurdle too. We got through that in 2015. And so we started to think about the future probably for the first time ever, because we were such in the moment just trying to keep up with what was coming at us, and it was coming at us so fast. We were fending off the slings and arrows, if you will. And today we're finally in a place where I think we can actually think about the future. We can plan for the future with some optimism and with some creativity that we simply just could not do in our near past. So all that to say, we thought the time was right to reimagine what we look like, what we are, what we communicate about ourselves. And so we came up with a revised logo that you see on the screen right now. And we're going to build kind of a rebrand around that. And we're going to talk about the things that we've talked about today. And frankly, we started, honestly, the rebrand many years ago when we started talking about more about people and not just a resource. Because what we do, you are all here presumably because what we do somehow affects you. So we're not this regulatory agency somewhere in a glass tower far away, making decisions in a vacuum. What I've always said about the EAA is that we do our work, we live, we go to church, we go out to restaurants with the people that we regulate. I as general manager, when I go to the local coffee shop, I can't hide. There's nowhere to hide. And that's good. That's not a bad thing. So transparency has to be at the forefront, and we have to be at the ready to tell our story. A branding campaign gives us the ability to tell that story in a way that makes sense and hopefully connects to the people that we regulate, and makes it easier to do that. So we're excited about that. We're excited about what the future holds. In spite of all the challenges we've talked about today, I will tell you that in this region, I'm really proud of the work that the EAA has done to connect with the people that we impact with our regulatory programs, and now with our non-regulatory programs as we're stretching out into the recharge zone and contributing zone and working with landowners and talking about real meaningful legacy that we can leave to the next generation. That's why we talk about next generation, because everything that we do takes time. And I tell people that come to work for us, when I get the chance, you come to work for the EAA, understand that there's not going to be much instant gratification in your work. It wasn't for me either when I took this job. I had to look ahead, and I had to think about at some point when I leave this place, will it look better than the way I found it? And I think we have that view of the Edwards Aquifer itself. When we're done with the work, which will never be done, but as generations come through and do this work, that's the marker. It's not so much instant gratification, but it's legacy building. And we're building a legacy into the next generation, and that is largely what this rebrand is about. It's an opportunity to launch into a legacy building mode for us as we look ahead.
Well, congratulations on that. It sounds like you've built a wonderful infrastructure moving forward for the protection of the aquifer. I'd like to open it back up to questions, and maybe...
Quick question. Yeah, we got a couple more
Yes, please.
before we wrap up.
Thank you, Bill. So, Roland, I'd like to say as a former board member that I'm very proud of having served on the EAA back in the early 2000s. Our collaboration, mutual collaboration that we did with SAWS at that time was phenomenal. Mr. Puente's endeavor to communicate with the public, engage in numerous meetings with the city to try and promote and also look at acquiring resources, other water resources, was phenomenal. One of the biggest challenges we faced when we were on the board at that time with the board of directors I served under, which was Mike Belden, Luana Buckner, and so forth, was that we had initiated an aggressive plan on a recharge and recirculation program. Where is that at this point, and what percentage or component of that has been on the approach from the EAA?
To that point on the recharge and recirculation has really become some of the work that Marc Hamilton was speaking to. Rather than building infrastructure with pipes, we've discovered that the more efficient way to go about enhancing recharge is through taking nature and helping nature do its best work. Through these conservation easement properties, improving the properties through improved soil, restoring the properties perhaps to the way they once were, maybe a generation or two generations ago, and let nature bring us the water naturally rather than some engineered solution that will cost a lot more. This creates a scenario where there's a lot of win-win opportunities between landowners, between our agency, between the city of San Antonio, for example. And so it takes time, and it's part of that generational view of how we can get there.
We've got time for one more question.
I just want to say thank you for this today because I learned a lot. I feel like sometimes we don't understand when our water bill goes up, and people are like, you can't water your lawn, you can't put water in your pool. We don't understand that as consumers. I have a business in San Antonio, which is Saws, and I live in the hill country that is the River Authority. So it gets really confusing sometimes when Saul's like, oh, you can have these days, but in the hill country, you have these days. So I think for me, as a consumer, I think education is super important, and I think there needs to be more of it. These guys are awesome because the weather guy is kind of where we get. Bill Taylor tells us how it works. So I applaud you guys for doing this, and I think that we need to continue and do more education because the consumers, sometimes we don't understand. You know, we don't understand when Bill says, the aquifer's low, but we had 5 inches of rain today. You know, we don't understand that there's a drought and we're trying to get the water levels back up. So thank you.
Great comment.
I want, if I could add on to that, I agree wholeheartedly about the education. We're committed to that. In fact, we're about 2 years into a new education outreach center that is next to our field research park. And so this is a space dedicated wholly to the purpose of educating people about this aquifer, how it works, what they can do to help. And so I encourage all you, it's free, if you will, follow up with us. That center is up and operational. It's right there on, if you're familiar with Gordon Hartman's Morgan Wonderland Camp, it's on his property, but we operate that center, and we're taking all comers who want to come and visit.
Thank you.
And we have a table over here with more information.
I'm going to close something out. Thank you so much for the wonderful comment. I'm going to do this really quick for each of you, starting with you, Scott, going backwards. If there's one thing that you want the audience to take away with them today, what is it from your camp?
Just that we're moving in a good direction in relation to the HCP and the programs that all of the entities at the permittees that are a part of this process. And I think that I just want to convey that it, as Roland has mentioned, this is a major reason why the EAA was formed, and I think that we're in a good spot, and we're progressing in a positive, healthy direction. In the next 30 years, I think you're going to be in a even better spot related to the protection of the aquifer and then how that impacts the species and habitat of the endangered species in the spring systems.
Thank you so much. Marc, what's your one-line takeaway?
My one-line takeaway is that I hope everybody walks away with a little bit better understanding of what we do, what the aquifer is, but really just the value of that resource. It's unique and it's special, and I hope everybody just takes away a little bit of that understanding today.
Thank you. Marc?
I would just follow up to what Roland said earlier. Is, from a regulatory standpoint, as we're transitioning from being litigious by necessity to trying to be more collaborative by opportunity, that we're from the government, but we really, really are here to help you.
Roland, final word?
The words that came to mind to me were science-based hope. You saw the science, and we're here to talk about hope, about what we can do with that science to make things better.
Wonderful. Join me in thanking this panel.
That's good, absolutely. Big thank you. And a big thank you to Sarah Schlessinger for an incredible moderation. Amazing job, amazing job. Also, a big thank you to the EAA staff for putting this event together today.